Hi, good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone joining this call. This is the session on leveraging 10,000 megawatts of geothermal for economic empowerment. We're joined by distinguished panelists and speakers, a number of stellar professionals with extensive experience in the field, and we're privileged to hear about their thoughts and insights on how to catalyze investments into geothermal so that we can ultimately have a positive economic impact. I would let each person introduce themselves one by one, and then we will go into a small presentation where we'll talk about the risks, investment costs, and potential productive uses of geothermal. We'll also see a few pictures of site visits to geothermal areas and see how the productive uses are actually impacting rural communities, especially women and children. We have practitioners in the field who have installed a massive, extensive geothermal power plants. We have people from the energy investment field. We have academia. We have, again, all very passionate people who are very interested in geothermal and very knowledgeable. I'll start with a quick, and please feel free to add your introduction into the chat, and we look forward to your feedback on. There will be a Q&A session at the end. After the presentation, we will go into a panel discussion on building the geothermal future, a practical pathway. And then we will ask each speaker to share their thoughts. So why geothermal? In Kenya, geothermal forms over 40% of the installed capacity. It is a major source of power, which is putting Kenya ahead of even Japan and Iceland. There is 865 megawatts of geothermal installed in Kenya, and this number is set to rise. Of course, this 865 is a very small number to the 10,000 megawatts of potential that is possible in East Africa. And what does this mean for the African continent as a whole? Geothermal is the second most abundant resource after solar. As of 2016, it was a $4.6 billion global industry powering homes, businesses in Southeast Asia, Europe, across the world. And its potential in Africa is yet to be tapped. There is a $400 million geothermal risk mitigation facility for Indonesia. On the continent, African continent, there is the $122 million geothermal risk mitigation facility, which all of these facilities are involved in de-risking investments into geothermal so that the potential can be unlocked and the use can be tapped in. And I will start with Dr. Omenda to introduce himself, and we'll move on to each speaker before we start with the presentation. Over to you, Dr. Omenda.
Thank you, sir. My name is Dr. Peter Omenda. I'm a geothermal expert of more than 30 years experience. I've worked with the main energy players in Kenya, that is KenGen and GDC. And on top of that, I've worked in many countries of Eastern Africa in trying to promote and develop the geothermal resources in these areas. Additionally, I'm a member of the board of directors of the International Geothermal Association and the current chairman of the Africa Geothermal Association. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Dr. Marita, over to you.
Hi, I'm Cliff Aaron. I'm the CEO of GreenMax Capital Group. We are financial advisors and fund managers in the clean energy space with a long history of organizing financing for the geothermal sector. For 5 years, we were the transaction advisors to GDC on the Menengai project. So we have a bit of insight into East Africa geothermal issues. I'm usually a New Yorker, but I am here for a few months in Nairobi and very glad to join this panel.
Thank you so much. Mr. George Aluru, over to you.
Good afternoon, good evening. My name is George Aluru. I am the managing director for a company called EcoEna. We are an IPP involved in mini hydro, wind, and solar. I am also the chairperson of the Electricity Sector Association of Kenya, which brings together independent power producers in all technologies, so geothermal, wind, solar, thermal, and also participants in commercial and industrial installations. So these are the people who do solar on rooftops of malls. At the same time, I also happen to chair the Kenya Private Sector Alliance's Energy and Extractive Sector Board, which now covers electricity, petroleum, and mining, and all the private companies that are active in that. So other than being a developer myself, I'm also very heavily involved in the associations that try to improve the business environment in the power sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, George. And Mr. Professor Marita, are you able to speak now?
I'm sorry, I'm really sorry about this. I'm just trying to get in touch with Margaret. Yeah, I am really sorry about this.
No worries. While we wait for them to be unmuted, I'll just give a quick background, and I think Ms. Pacifica Algola is also there. Let me just give a brief background. Ms. Pacifica Algola is the Director for Climate Change at the Kenya State Department. The directorate was established in climate change as per the Climate Change Act of 2016, and is mandated to provide vision, leadership, guidance, coordination on matters relating to climate change in the country. It's the lead government agency to provide the National Climate Change Action Plans and deliver on the operational coordination. She's also the Joint Secretary to the National Climate Change Action Plan Task Force. Additionally, we also have Professor Marita, and he is a quite experienced professional. He's currently the Senior Lecturer and Director of Geothermal Training and Research Institute at Dedan Kimathi University of Technology in Kenya. He's held senior positions at KenGen, and he has a track record of accomplishments in the geothermal industry. And we are very honored to have all the guests today. So I will start now with Dr. Omenda to give a short overview on the geothermal potential, what it means, and the risks and investments involved. Allow me to kindly share my screen.
Yes, it's visible, but you could.
Yes. Is that fine?
Yes, that's fine. That's good.
Excellent. Over to you, Dr. Omenda. I will jump right into. Yeah.
Yes, before we start this, I'd like to state that I'm currently a consulting geothermal expert, and I've had the opportunity to visit many countries in Africa. And therefore, geothermal typically is defined as an energy resource, which is natural, and therefore is available everywhere in the world, including everywhere within the African continent. However, to develop geothermal resources, you need areas with anomalous heat, that is heat higher than the normal Earth's geothermal gradient. And in Africa, it has been defined that geothermal systems could occur in many places, but the highest potential area lies within the East African Rift. And this is because of the young volcanism that has made magma to be shallow and therefore able to drive the geothermal system. Additionally, areas of active tectonics is usually very good in terms of being able to transmit high heat flow, but additionally able to allow for full water circulation to create beds, which then can drive a geothermal system. In Africa, it has been estimated that out of the high temperature resources, we could have more than 20,000 megawatts. I know Worcester have indicated that the potential is 10,000, but from studies that we have undertaken, we are looking at about 20,000 megawatts if to all to be developed. And that's the high temperature resources only. If you look at the map on the left, the circled areas are areas of non-geothermal areas. Some of them are defined by strong manifestations like hot springs, fumaroles, and in other areas are low to medium temperature. If you look at the eastern side of the map for East Africa, along the East African Rift, that's where we have all the high temperature geothermal systems, which currently is being used to generate electricity in Kenya. The other areas have been defined as low to medium temperature resources, but nonetheless, they're still usable They may produce some electricity, but most of the use would be in direct applications, as we'll see in the next slide, please. What is defined as the high temperature resources are those with temperatures of more than 200 degrees C at about a kilometer depth. And these are typically, as I said, occurring within the East African Ridge System. Most of these resources are used for power generation and also direct use. There's currently a push towards using the energy for power generation, and when the temperature drops, you use it for other applications, which in the geothermal industry we call direct application or utilization. However, the lower temperature resources, whereas some can be used for some electricity generation, but we look at it mostly for direct applications. And direct applications include food drying, industrial processing, greenhouse heating of all types, agriculture. In some countries where there is need to heat or cool houses, then geothermal can be used efficiently to provide heat or cooling that would be required. I'd like to state that in Africa, most of the most abundant type of geothermal resources that are available are the low and medium temperature resources. And therefore, there's a strong push towards really investigating the occurrence and how they can be used in addition to the traditional high temperature resources that have been considered for power generation. So there's a strong push for direct application because this would employ much more people, would have more economic impact to the communities and the countries where the resources are located. Yes, I'd like to say that geothermal is not a new industry, nor is it a new science in Africa. Olkaria-1 geothermal power plant in Kenya has been operating since 1982 at more than 93% capacity factor. And that's absolutely good compared to, say, wind, which is less than 30%, solar, less than 20%. So geothermal really provides baseload. And that's how Kenya decided to really champion development of geothermal resources. And as Utsav said, currently we have an installed capacity of 865 megawatts, providing more than 45% of energy consumed in the country. And since Olkaria-1, many power plants now have come up in Olkaria, there are many coming up in the other non-geothermal areas under development like Menengai and other areas. So in the next slide, you can see that 865 for the whole continent over so many years, more than 40 years since the first power plant at Olkaria, that's very, very slow growth. And the main reason is that there has been a perception that geothermal energy development is high risk. And that has been attributed to high upfront costs. Because geothermal, when you develop it, you are like buying, you're buying the fuel in advance of generation for the next 40, even 45 years. And therefore, that expenditure, people have looked at it as very high. And more so, at the early stages before power plant development, drilling covers a major cost. 35 to 40% of a geothermal project is a drilling cost. And therefore, as we'll see later, drilling needs to be managed very, very well. However, whereas there are these high expenditures at the early stage, they can be managed. For example, overall, there's about 85% success rate in drilling. So if the wells are well sited, then you have a overall 78% chance of success. That's from the many wells that have been drilled globally. And for the first of the 3 exploration wells, the success rate is considered to be about 50%. And by the time you get to the appraisal drilling stage, then success rates moves from 59% to 74%. By the time you're doing production wells, then the success rate is 83%. If you achieve, or if the project achieves this kind of estimates, then the project can be viable and will provide very good returns. Because the wells that would be considered failures would be used for either injection, so they are not completely wasted, or even monitoring wells, which otherwise you still need to drill. So the risk perception is high, but there are risks that can be managed if the project is developed properly. Now, just looking at a typical geothermal project, and here we're having an example of a 50 megawatt power plant, starting from the initial stages, how much should it cost the project to be developed. The initial stage is permitting and getting the license for the area. The estimate is about $1 million, but often it can go even up to $2 million because we want to do a lot of pre-planning and the government getting various government approvals. Exploration stage actually is one of the most critical stages of the project. This is where the surface studies needs to be done very, very efficiently. And here the cost would be anywhere between $2 and $3 million. The cost is variable because you may choose to do some studies and leave out some. The project area may be, some may be small, some may be as large as 1,000 square kilometers, and therefore the cost for evaluating a large area would naturally be high. But here we recommend that all the studies that can be done should be done so that you minimize the risk for failure when you get into the test drilling stage. And as you can see, normally test drilling requires drilling of 3 wells. And previously the 3 wells were standard wells, that is completed with a 7-inch slotted liner casing. But nowadays there's a push to slim holes to reduce the cost during the initial risky stages. And therefore you can see the cost of this last stage varies widely from $11 million to even $30 million, depending on the depth, the size of the hole. And therefore the average is considered about $5 to $6 million a well. Once that stage is successful, is then you get into the feasibility study, really determine where to drill appraisal wells, how many appraisal and how many production wells to be drilled. And therefore, typically the feasibility study stage will depend on, again, the size of the project and what needs to be evaluated. Therefore, an average of $7 million is usually the case. Coming to the appraisal and drilling, often 20 wells may be required. And here we are saying that each well would vary in cost from $4 million and even more. That's why you can see the cost of drilling is up to $100 million. But if the drilling program is managed effectively, then we can have a rate of less than $5 million a well. The construction of power plants usually is about $2 million, but nowadays we know you can get as low as $1.5 million per megawatt because of improvement in technology and efficiency of the power plant and all that. The steam gathering cost usually is about $500,000 per megawatt. And again, it varies a little. And therefore, to develop a 50 megawatt power plant, we are looking at an amount which is about $3.9 to $5.5 million per megawatt installed. And therefore, for a 50 megawatt power plant, we are looking at about $200 million if the project is managed very carefully. And to fit with the theme of this conference, in the next slide, if you were to develop 10,000 megawatts, how much funds would we require? The photo on the left is one of the beautiful Bulgaria power plants, still new, 5 years old. And therefore, using the rate that we indicated at $3.9 million a megawatt, 10,000 megawatts installation in Africa, therefore, would cost about $39 to $55 billion. And the development period could be somewhere in the range of 15 or 20 years because of the stages it has to go through. And using a rate of 0.07 US dollars per kilowatt hour, we are looking at a revenue of a gross revenue of $5.8 billion. That's 95% capacity factor of the power plants, which is usually achievable. It can even be higher. And therefore, as we develop this power plant, we see there is almost very low operation cost over the life of the plant because there are no fuel purchases. The high cost would be associated with just the additional makeup wells to be drilled. So typically, payback period for a geothermal power plant will be less than 12 years. For some, it's even better if if fewer wells are drilled because of high output. Next slide. So where do we get funds to invest in the 10,000 megawatts? For the existing power plants in Kenya, for example, the funds have come from multilateral and bilateral banks. Green funds is coming into play. We have not received much of it, but we are seeing that in the coming years, we should be able to tap more into the green funds. The government has been a major supporter of geothermal projects. Actually, most of the funding are loans through the government of Kenya, and that has made the power plants to be developed very quickly. Private equity is becoming a major player, and the government, for example, in Kenya is really pushing for private investors to come into the geothermal sector to fast track. Because the plan of the government is that in the coming years, geothermal should be playing more of the base load, because they want to shut down all the polluting power generating sources. We are looking at green bonds, and in Kenya, there's really keen interest in using green bonds to finance some of these. There's the insurance to cover some of the risky parts of the projects. Grants like GRMF has come into play, supporting exploration studies and also exploration drilling, which has been very useful. Technical assistance has come from various players like UNEP, New Zealand government, Italy government, US government, and many other countries that offer technical assistance. We've been pushing commercial banks to show interest in the geothermal sector. They're still slow because they perceive the risk as very high, but as we move forward, we'll start seeing commercial banks really playing a significant part in geothermal development in Africa. That's the summary I have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Amanda. And noticing what you said about the potential being actually 20,000 megawatts, you have to double all of these numbers. so that's good to know. Excellent.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We'll move on now to Professor Morita. If you could unmute yourself and let us know about the productive uses of geothermal energy.
I have unmuted myself.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Can you hear me, Elsa?
Yes, loud and clear.
Oh, good. Thank you so much. And I appreciate the overview by Dr. Menda very well. He needs to be converted from being a scientist to an economist. He has done the financing part very well, which I appreciate. And as you notice, Dr. Menda's focused more on electrical power generation. And he also mentioned that geothermal resources can be grouped into two major components, as the high enthalpy and the low enthalpy. And they also mentioned that the low enthalpy geothermal resources are the most abundant. So I'm privileged today to report to you our findings when we were sponsored by the United Nations and United States Development Agency, USAID, who funded us to go out and identify regions of low enthalpy and how they can be used to service the rural poor communities. As you know, most of the geothermal areas are found in remote areas, are not found in urban areas. And those areas are, those areas that own the resources, but you find that if they are developed, much of the power is actually exported, so to say, to urban areas for use. So, but the people, the local communities own the resource, but they are not really benefiting per se. Next slide, please. And a quick overview is that most of the rural areas where geothermal resources are found are lacking in very many issues. Those could be social, economic, and so on. And the most glaring one is that they lack the very basic needs, that's water and energy. And so they are quite poor, but we came with the conclusion that if their geothermal resources are utilized, their social standing or their standard of living could actually increase. Next, please. So that picture there you see is ladies and women, young girls are getting water from a well. And then for their energy, they depend on cutting down nearby trees and shrubs, and therefore that can again encourage deforestation. So the thing that we need to focus on is mainly water and energy. Next, please. Yes, traditionally, geothermal has been used by the local people by doing some condensation of fumaroles or the steam coming out of the ground. they condense that, and some may not be very clean, but they do get some water from it, even though it's sometimes contaminated because of the way they're cooling the water. But traditionally, residents of geothermal sites have used this resource to get water for their daily needs and even to water their animals. Next, please. And again, I don't know if it's a coincidence, most of the geothermal areas are found in pastoralist lands where people move from place to place. And the reason why they move from place to place, you and I know that is mainly looking for pastures and water. So it's possible if water is provided, they can actually settle down. Next, please. Yeah, pastoralism contributes quite a lot of goods, including dairy, meat, skins. It can also provide fertilizer and fuel. More importantly, also it can provide for ecotourism if harnessed and used well. Next, please. Also, in pastoralism pastoralist areas, you find animals that actually can give milk if watered well and if given enough food. So they can provide milk, and this milk can actually, if it's processed using geothermal energy, could actually give the residents some income. Next, please. The other benefits in most of the areas that we visited, both Ethiopia, Tanzania, and here in Kenya, are they also have honey. They can harvest some water for irrigation, for example, but there is need to carry out an economic analysis to determine how viable those projects can be. Next, please. It's important if a project has to be developed to involve the local people, you have to meet them, not just leaders, but one has to meet them and discuss what the project will be, and you explain to them or ask them to volunteer any choices, because you will have different choices of where they can apply. For example, is it the honey that they would like to process, or is it what they're most in need of, or is it do they depend for their livelihood, meat products and so on. So by consulting them, you are able to come up with some project that actually is embraced by the local communities themselves. Next, please. Yes, the other thing that we realized was that from our findings is that geothermal can be used in very many places there, depending on the temperatures of your initial fluids. If they're say 100, you can use them for refrigeration, for drying, food processing, or greenhouses. You can actually also use them if they're not very well contaminated. You can use them as fresh water or close to fresh water for irrigation and so on. Next, please. So all that can be put together. In fact, the current talk is to see how they can create a geothermal village, in which a village is set up around a geothermal site, which has these applications. For example, in drying, in fish processing, for example, this is a lake nearby. So there are so many of those activities that can actually be enhanced and by using geothermal liquids. This could enable this the local communities to come around in a geothermal village where you have various applications which are cascaded. You can also have ecotourism that will be very prevalent which is now prevalent in Olkaria, and where you can attract people, visitors who can come and enjoy themselves. And that way now the residents will not, once they get these job opportunities, are not willing to move away from there. So now they settle down. So it's easy now to bring in their what they need, like infrastructure, roads, dispensaries, schools, etc. So they settle down. So by developing geothermal, especially the low enthalpy fluids, local communities can have their living standards enhanced, and then that way, you can talk about developing the local communities. On the right-hand side there, that you will see a spa that is using geothermal water in Olkaria, and it has actually understand it has actually paid itself since it was constructed. When you consider the number of visitors going there, especially weekends. Next, please. I think that's all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Morita. It was really interesting to hear you talk about the geothermal village concept, and I will definitely ask you also to share your thoughts and knowledge on the case studies of how indigenous communities all over the world, especially lessons from, I think, New Zealand and other places, how can the community benefit, and how is the intellectual property rights over these resources shared with the community. Thank you so much again for the presentation. I really appreciate the insights. We'll move on now to the discussion on the building a geothermal future. What is a practical pathway? So I would like to start now with the Ms. Pacifica Algola. We missed the chance to hear about you, so if you could quickly introduce yourself, we will have that, and then we will go on with the discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm Dr. Pacifica Algola. I work for the Ministry of Environment and Forestry as the Director of Climate Change. I worked for KenGen for 16 years before moving to the Ministry of Environment. And I'm also currently new in the GCF board. I'm also a member of the carbon offset scheme, the advisory board of the carbon offset scheme for aviation. And I also serve in other boards. And most importantly, I am can I call it, I don't want to say I'm the head of AWAG, that is African Women Advancing Geothermal for now, but I'm just holding post until we do elections. So thank you very much. So in as far as my current role is concerned, is mostly focusing on policy, implementing Kenya's national determined contribution, and also ensuring that we are leading the climate negotiation process. So thank you very much. I don't have a PowerPoint, but I hope I'll be able to speak and transmit the information. So in terms of the role of geothermal, I want to look at it globally, and the policy direction that we are seeing in the climate change space. We've heard about the phase out of coal and other fossil, inefficient fossil fuel plants. And there's a big rise in push for renewable energy, and particularly wind, hydro, geothermal, and the rest. So we are seeing a paradigm shift where now space has been opened for a lot of countries to develop their renewable resources, which are indigenous. And for us in Kenya, we are very lucky, as Dr. Menda has indicated. We have only exploited less than 10% of our potential geothermal resources. And so as we look at this, I see an opportunity for this increasing in the energy mix of the country because of the commitments that you have undertaken in climate action. And also because with climate change, again, we are seeing a lot of droughts and floods recurring. And before we had geothermal way back in the 90s and also in the early 20s, we had to get the mobile diesel generators to compensate for the dry spells during the droughts in 2000, which really impacted our hydro. Back then, the hydro was the base load. So we've seen the importance of having a very rich energy mix. And it's important because we're able to also give opportunities to other technologies to develop and stabilize the system. So we are aware that the energy demand is not where we expect it to be in Kenya. And we also know that Kenya is a fast-growing economy in the region. And we have our Vision 2030, which sets targets for industrialization. And in the Vision 2030 agenda, you could see that there are those demand drivers which were set out in the vision, and they are very big milestone projects which were supposed to be developed, but were not developed. And that has really reduced the demand. And as we move forward, and as I said, that the world is now shifting to cleaner energy sources, I see a rise in e-mobility, particularly to offset pollution, both air pollution and the greenhouse gas emissions. And we are also now thinking about how to electrify our standard gauge railway system. And again, that is a potential power source. And also have, we've taken a very ambitious strategy of shifting to clean cooking by 2028. And part of that shift will require a lot of transition to clean cooking using electricity. We know the price is, the tariff is kindly prohibitive, but we are sure that the government's commitment to this will make sure that we make this shift sustainably. One of our Vision 2030 agendas, as I've said earlier, is to be industrialized by 2030. And also our president's, one of his legacy agenda is in manufacturing. And so we've seen a lot of initiatives around incentivizing manufacturing processes across the country. We've seen special economic zones being developed to encourage investors to come and invest in the country. We are also seeing a push to have local manufacturers and local Kenya products being manufactured in Kenya. And we hope that this will be able to drive the demand for energy. But while we are doing this, we're also aware that there's a lot of work that needs to be done in energy efficiency. And therefore, we also have to work closely with all the stakeholders to make sure that we apply the energy efficiency regulations that are required. So in our 20-year rolling least cost development plan, there's been there is a lot of coal power plants which are planned for beyond 2035, and I'm sure they were planned because there was a demand that was foreseen in the future, especially with the rise with the population growth that we are seeing in the country. But we know that if we have to make concerted effort to replace the coal power plants that are planned for with an indigenous form of energy, and that is likely to be geothermal energy, because we don't have a lot of hydro resources. I think the last time I checked, our maximum potential for hydropower generation was 3,000 megawatts. And most of it has been exploited. I think it's almost 800 megawatts that has been exploited. And with the recurrent droughts and the increasing temperature, we don't have a chance, we don't have a fighting chance with hydro. So that leaves us with wind, solar, and geothermal. And to stabilize the system, then the stimulation of the demand needs to go in the direction of geothermal energy. But I see a big space because of the targets we have taken on e-mobility being the disruptor of this process. And then geothermal energy and also other renewable projects are very good because you can actually earn additional carbon credits from them, and this can generate revenue. KenGen has earned, I think, I don't know where they are at now, but I know it's millions of tons of CO2 emission reduction that have been achieved from various geothermal power plants, and I think 2 hydropower plants that has really incentivized the company to continue investing. And there's a lot of untapped potential also in earning carbon credits in low temperature utilization, which has not been exploited. And it's the fastest way of getting credits that I know, because now I'm in the Ministry of Environment and Forestry, and I see the way the forestry process is very, very, very complicated, but whereas the energy process is very quick. So opportunities are there. In Glasgow last year, we just finalized Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the one that is now guiding implementation of international and the national carbon credits. It's going to be a bit different from Kyoto, and at the national level, we are now working on a framework for ensuring implementation of Article 6, and we want this to be accompanied with a lot of capacity building so that we can mobilize private sector investment to catalyze action in mitigation and also in building resilience. So to do all this, it's important that we have the capacity and the resources to achieve our objective in this industry. A lot of investment has been made by the various Ministry of Energy and the various state agencies that are involved, mainly Kenya Power, KenGen, and GDC, and I think other IPPs have also maybe invested in capacity building. And we've also received a lot of support from the government of Iceland and the government of New Zealand. And I have to say that I'm one of the beneficiaries of this capacity building. And my journey in I worked for KenGen in general, and I worked in doing environmental audits and impact assessment across the company, including in geothermal projects. But I can say that my knowledge base increased when I attended the 6 months training, and also when I did my PhD in Iceland. So it's very, very important that as we do this capacity building, we also take into cognizance the gap, the gender balance, so that we have more men and women represented in the industry. Because of that, we've seen a lot of improvement in representation of women, but a lot still need to be done. And that's why now in 2016, as African women, we decided, we agreed on creating African Women Advancing Geothermal during the AGIO meeting in Addis Ababa, and this was launched in November of 2020. And we have now managed to mobilize women across the continent to join this initiative. And we are also trying to work closely with women who are interested in working in geothermal technology, whether they are in the industry or not, and to spur opportunities for professional and economic development through mentorships, network facilitation, advocacy, and also work closely with women or women groups. And also men are welcome in developing geothermal projects. Particularly, we at the moment focusing on small scale geothermal project. And last year there's a small geothermal project, geothermal utilization project, low temperature utilization project that was launched in Nakuru, focusing on agriculture. And we feel that those of us who started the journey should handhold the younger people who are coming up, the graduates and the professionals, the consultants, and the corporate people who are still just coming into this process. That's why, despite moving to the Ministry of Environment, I'm still a geothermal foot soldier. Yeah. So we have, as an association, we have our own bylaws, our own code of conducts. We also have a logo, and we are led by a president. And also we are hoping to have very strong regional coordinators, board members, and of course, a country champion. And this is very important to us because expansion of geothermal will also, if we succeed in our effort as AWAG, we will see an expanded job market, both for women and for men, and we will also see making progress towards achieving Sustainable Development Goals 1, 5, 7, and 13. And for our, it's not just about the professional woman wanting more women in the profession, but it's also making a difference. And some of the examples of the difference that we can make have been presented by similar projects that have been presented by Dr. Marita. So in terms of how geothermal energy is contributing to Kenya's NDC, we submitted, NDC is the nationally determined contribution, and it's a contribution that we are obligated to make under the Paris Agreement to show how we are going to reduce emissions in order to achieve the global target of 2 degrees and working towards 1.5 degree warming by 2100. So the first NDC that we submitted, we committed to reducing 30% of emissions. And in December 2020, we submitted another one, committing now to reduce 32% against a business as usual scenario by 2030. So before submitting the second NDC, we did an analysis, just self-evaluation to see how we performed in the first NDC with such ambitious target. And we had 6 mitigation sectors. We had transport, agriculture, energy, waste, manufacturing, and forestry. And so this target was wholesome, and we had to show the progress we had made from between 2015 and 2020. And this is done using our greenhouse gas inventory process. And it was very, very clear that we were not able to meet our target in most of the sectors, except in the energy sector. I think in the energy sector, we surpassed the target. So because we surpassed the target, we were able to compensate for the emissions that we had in the forestry sector. So I think, the reason why we surpassed that target is purely because of the geothermal development and the faster rate in which geothermal development was seen in that period. Moving into 2030, we are also focusing on the pipeline projects that have been presented for Kenya in geothermal development, and we hope that this is what will help us achieve our Paris Agreement target and also our long-term strategy for 2050. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ogola. And I think you underplayed your role as being the first African woman graduate in PhD from the University of Iceland. So thank you for sharing your thoughts, and really appreciate you inspiring and paving the way for so many others to follow that journey and contribute to renewable energy in Kenya. So thank you. I'll move on to Mr. George Aluru and request him to share his experience representing the electricity suppliers of Kenya. If you could explain now, what are the challenges faced by developers? We heard Dr. Omenda talk about the initial upfront costs. The almost 70% of the costs are involved in the drilling, and even before the cash flow has started, there is a significant cost. So what are the challenges, Kenya? How are developers looking at it? How is the government and a financial system supporting this development for such a key strategic resource?
Thank you, Utsav. Again, thank you for inviting me to join this distinguished panel. I think the previous presenters have really done a good job, good service at explaining the main issues. And as you mentioned, the biggest challenge for independent power producers active in geothermal is, of course, that upfront risk in proving your resource and actually getting off. So the cost of drilling, these are the kind of challenges that they face. To some extent, this has been redressed by the formation of the Geothermal Development Company. They've done some drilling, like in Menengai, where they've de-risked the upfront bit of geothermal exploration. And then private companies have then been invited to kind of bid on just the power plant part of the project. Yeah, but in principle, for those IPPs that had been trying to go in parallel with what GDC is doing, I think a lot of them have really faced serious challenges. And, they sink in money and the well is dry. Money is gone. So, and they need to fundraise for every well that they do, then they go for another fundraising, which is really difficult for them. They really find it very, very difficult. I've also seen a lot of attempts at collaboration with KenGen. So they talk to KenGen and try to get some of the KenGen rigs to do the wells for them. I think there's a lot of opportunity also in terms of cooperation between what KenGen is doing, GDC, and the private companies, at least in ensuring that they already invested resources like in the GDC in terms of the rigs that they own, can then also somehow be utilized by the private companies to drill for the resource for their power plants. That is of course the main challenge, but also there are some other challenges such as, you will always be compared with the KenGen. I think there's been a lot of talk about the tariffs of the IPPs compared to those of KenGen. I think the way private companies finance is often more expensive than public companies. KenGen is as a quasi-public company. I mean, they can access financing at much cheaper rates, 2%, something like that. On average, if you check at their weighted average cost of capital, in the last financial reports, you'll see that the debt that they're holding is at about 2%, compared to a private company who would access a concessional funding at 6%, 7%. So then that really has a big impact on how you convert towards your tariff. Your tariff will more likely always be higher. And this is one of the things that really independent power producers have been facing, and this across the board, not just in geothermal. So yeah, I would say those are the challenges in terms of independent power producers.
Thank you. That's really helpful and really interesting to note about the gap between the financing, especially for private versus public. 2 to 6% is quite significant. I'll come back to you, George, to ask you about the future applications. But in between, I would just like to jump to Mr. Clifford Aaron and ask him, with his experience at the Menengai project, what were the kind of challenges in that project? How did it get operationalized? What are the lessons now in practical operationalization of future geothermal projects?
Thanks, and pleasure to join you today. Thanks again for asking me. That's a tough question that you've asked, because today we're about 10, 11 years into GDC's history. More than $1 billion has been spent, and many wells have been drilled quite successfully, but still there's no kilowatt hours that are being generated from the Menengai field. So you have to ask yourself, why is that? And it comes back to an essential facet of geothermal energy financing, at least on the power side. We're talking now about the power generation side. The things that Professor Morita talked about at community level are financed in a completely different spectrum. So there's different business models. There's different ways of organizing finance. One way is an all public model, which is for most of its history how KenGen has financed geothermal power development, and they've been unbelievably successful. You have to consider KenGen to be one of the premier developers and operators of geothermal on the planet. The problem with the old public, the benefit of the old public model is, as George mentioned, the access to capital is cheaper, and the result is a lower tariff. But the challenge, of course, is if you want to develop 5,000 megawatts or 10,000 megawatts or even 3,000 megawatts, there's a limit to what the public coffers can afford. So it's necessary to find ways of leveraging in private capital. So one way of doing that is the original business model for GDC, which was drill 2 or 3 wells, de-risk the field, and then bring in private IPP developers to complete the development of the field, operate the steam field, and sell power to KPLC. This model has worked in several places in the world, and most importantly, it's worked in the fastest growing geothermal market anywhere globally, which is Turkey. Turkey, about a dozen years ago, had less than 50 megawatts of geothermal. And today they have nearly 2,000 megawatts. I think it's over 1,800 megawatts of geothermal installed and operating now, and plans to double that in the next 4 or 5 years. And they did that precisely through that model: de-risk, sell the concession once it's been de-risked to a private investor, and then let that investor invest the balance of capital and be the owner operator of the plant. GDC, I believe, lost its way a bit and decided to become the steam field operator. So instead of just turning over the field, GDC decided we're going to do something that no one's really ever done before, which is to own and operate the resource, selling steam to IPP developers. And this was quite ambitious, because what happened along the way are 2 things. One, investors and lenders looked at that configuration and said, well, wait a minute, GDC is filled with very talented people, most of whom came from KenGen, but as an organization, they've never done this before. Also, they are a state-owned entity which has shown in its history that it is often influenced by political considerations rather than just business considerations, commercial considerations. So investors really got cold feet. And what they did is they then went back to government and said, okay, look, if we're gonna rely upon steam supply from an unproven organization that's state-owned, government has to guarantee the resource. And government initially came back and said, well, wait a minute. When private sector drills for hydrocarbons, or when private sector mines for minerals, the government of Kenya doesn't guarantee the resource. Why should we guarantee it here? And to a large extent, they're right, because what happened is government wound up not investing the capital themselves, but taking on the contingent liability of failure of the resource anyway, and encumbering the national treasury with those contingent liabilities. And it took, literally 5 or 6 years for this process, and we were the transaction advisors all through that process, to culminate in government, which originally was firmly saying, and rightly so, why should we guarantee this resource, to saying that the only way this process can go forward is if we do so. So now you've seen that the concessions are starting to move forward. But another issue that occurred that delayed the process, as you know, is often the case in Kenya and in other countries in Africa, the procurement process for selecting the IPPs was less than perfect. And so out of the 3 IPPs chosen, really only one had experience in the geothermal sector. And so over time, what happened is that, you know, there was a realization that these companies were never going to be able to implement these projects, and they were in the game only to sell the projects, and they would only sell the projects once this issue of the government guarantee was resolved. So, you know, I think with, you know, better planning from the beginning, that time period and understanding, you know, what private capital and private lenders' risk perspective would be on the business model, this time period could have been shortened by, you know, 6 or 7 years.
Sure, thank you. That's really interesting to know that background, and also the approach to attract IPPs by drilling, de-risking, and then bringing them on board. So to ask you an interesting question, considering that the topic of discussion is a practical pathway to, you know, leveraging geothermal for economic empowerment. So you have the challenges and limitations of geothermal as an energy source, that even though it's 24 hours, it's location dependent. So as Professor Marita also showed us, many of the you know, communities who stand to benefit from this source are rural communities in far off areas with possibly small units. So in terms of achieving the maximum economic impact, and also considering that Kenya has universal electricity targets to provide you know, the whole population with electricity, but also considering that Kenya, Uganda, many countries are power surplus and not able to meet the demand. In your view, now understanding these technologies, the limitations, what is it better to develop rural sources of energy? Is it better to go for utility scale sources of energy, or is there a middle path which can achieve economic impact in terms of job creation and productive use? What would you suggest with your vast experience in this area?
Wow, that's a big question. I mean, you know, a lot of thought, you know, has gone into the, you know, Kenya electrification plan, and, you know, determining, you know, how, I mean, first of all, Kenya has done a remarkably good job amongst its peers in Africa in increasing the electrification rate. I mean, when I first started coming here in 2005, 2006, you know, I think the electrification rate was maybe 20 or 30%, and today we're up, I think, close to 70%. You know, this is absolutely remarkable achievement. And the electrification plan, which I think now has extended to maybe 2024, 2025. Colleagues can say better when 100% access should be achieved, has, you know, very intelligently segmented, you know, where is it cost effective to extend the grid? Where is it cost effective to build mini grids? Where is it most cost effective to utilize individual solar home systems, with an eye towards how each of these should be financed. And the number I'm most familiar with is, because we're working on it in a project right now, is 2.18 million households that should receive individual solar home systems as their form of electrification, meaning that they are too remote to either be connected to the grid directly or to be served with a mini grid, because there's not enough of a cluster of households together. They're spread out in a remote area. So, you know, the government has a great plan, and now is trying to figure out the best ways for financing, in particular, the mini grid portion and the solar home system portion. I don't think that for rural electrification, putting in small scale rural geothermal generation plants is the right approach. I think much better approach for utilizing geothermal resources in rural areas is precisely what Professor Morita presented, which is to find the match between low enthalpy heat and community activities, community entrepreneurial activities. The good news is to develop those geothermal resources will be much less expensive, because to drill a low enthalpy well, you don't have to go down nearly as deep, and you can find out more information from surface studies about and predict the result. So that's great. But the bad news in this equation is that the opportunity for that to be a profitable venture for anyone drilling that well is remote. So it really needs to be a publicly funded activity that's part of rural development, rural economic development, to say, okay, we're gonna drill these wells, and then we're going to provide incentives to attract development of small scale enterprises that can use these resources. It's the same in, when you electrify a village, and now there's an opportunity to attract productive uses of energy. You can now have a electrified grain mill. You can now have a electrified pumping system. You can now have stone crushing, et cetera, et cetera. It's really the same equation, but by bringing electrification to those communities, you create opportunity for rural development. But private sector can't, without heavy subsidies, electrify those communities. And it's the same thing. Private sector is not going to develop these low enthalpy geothermal resources. There needs to be public investment in it.
Sure. Thank you so much, Mr. Clifford Allen. That's really helpful to understand and get more clarity. I'd like to move on to the future applications of geothermal, and I'll go on back to George and just ask him. He had some interesting ideas and thoughts on the applications of geothermal. So, George, please do share, 2 or 3 areas where you feel geothermal would be most valuable, and how it could help Kenya and other countries in a similar situation to leverage the geothermal resource. Thank you.
First, just to reiterate what Clifford was saying, that for us to reach the more rural populations, the approach has to be very different. It can't be that we are building our power plant at some kind of low demand center. So I think that it has to be like really organic growth, like whether you're growing from solar home system to a mini grid, then to a mini grid that is connected to the main grid that is then supplied by a bigger geothermal power plant. And it has to really be, I think it's the most efficient way to use the resources that we have. Coming back to the applications of geothermal, I think one of the most interesting things is that we now find ourselves in a position where we have a really huge potential, like 10 gigawatt as a country. But now we can't develop this 10 gigawatt when we don't have 10 gigawatt of demand. I think there's someone who alluded to Vision 2030 projects and them not having been built. I think it was Dr. Algola, if I remember well. And this is the kind of situation we find ourselves as a country. So people have been thinking around what can be done. So we do need to increase the demand. And one of the really interesting areas that has come about is what we call power to X. So and mostly the X has been hydrogen. So power to hydrogen. And we use the kind of excess renewable energy that we have, cheap excess renewable energy, both in geothermal, wind, and solar, to then produce hydrogen. And we don't produce hydrogen just for the sake of having hydrogen. We produce hydrogen so that we can then move into fertilizer, into e-fuels. But of more interest is the fertilizer aspect. At the moment, Kenya is spending something like 30 billion shillings a year in terms of subsidies to fertilizer that comes in through the port of Mombasa, and it's coming from Russia, it's coming from Saudi Arabia and other European countries. This fertilizer, then the cost really builds up as you start transporting it from Mombasa to the hinterland where most of the big farms are, your Uasin Gishus and Eldorets. So by the time the fertilizer is landing on the other side of Kenya, it's quite expensive. While at the same time, there is a chance if we do scale enough to produce enough hydrogen, using the hydrogen and nitrogen from the air, you can end up easily with let's say a calcium ammonium nitrate kind of fertilizer. And for this, a typical case would be like a 70 ton per day, which is a small fertilizer factory, would require something like 70 megawatt worth of electricity. And if, let's say, we position this in a place like Naivasha, you're next to the big geothermal fields, you have water resources available, you have good logistics to the hinterland, and even Naivasha itself is an area that has a lot of farming activity, and you're producing a fertilizer where you actually need it. So this, I think, will be one of the biggest trends that we'll see. It will really be important because we'll be killing two birds with one stone. We save on foreign currency by reducing the amount of money you're spending on fertilizer subsidies. We produce more locally available fertilizer that will be easier to reach the markets, and then also improve the yields on the farms, which is a really big, important thing for us. And you can even think that then would snowball into us importing less and less of the food that we eat. I don't know if you saw the recent statistics, but we are kind of a net importer of food at the moment. Our trade deficit with our neighbors, which is Tanzania and Uganda, has really flipped in their favor because of the amount of food that we are importing. So, but in terms of using that geothermal resource to produce fertilizer, I think it will be a really crucial thing going forward. I know there's studies at government level, at the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Agriculture. There's some private companies that are also looking into the possibilities of doing fertilizer using hydrogen from renewable energy. Of course, the numbers are still in favor of fertilizer being made from natural gas, and that's why a lot of our fertilizer is being imported from Russia and Saudi Arabia. So fertilizer production will be one of them. And then, of course, the other thing is to look at what's happening regionally. I think last week or 2 weeks before that, the Ethiopians launched the first unit of their big 6 gigawatt dam, which is, I think they launched about 340 megawatt of the first unit of the Renaissance dam. The interconnection with Kenya is almost done. There's an interconnection into Tanzania, but then it doesn't go into Southern Africa, which is a big loss, if you ask me, because we have seen a lot of power shortages in the south of Africa. I think 2 years back there was a serious drought that led to serious power shortages in Zambia, in Zimbabwe. Then at the very same time there was the delay of the new coal plants in South Africa, and now they're even thinking of shutting down more coal plants. So in the south of Africa, we will face a situation where they're in energy deficit, while we are sitting on a potential in East Africa of tens of gigawatts. If you combine what Kenya has in geothermal, what Uganda has in hydro, what Ethiopia has in hydro, I think one of the really key opportunities for us to explore our geothermal potential is in the activation of this African power pools, East Africa power pool to be specific, and its interconnection to the South African power pool. Work has been ongoing on that. It's a bit slow. I think even the AU also did announce the Africa single electricity market. And I think one of the things that would benefit from that effort of the AU is the East African power pool. There's a need for us as a country to act selfishly, kind of do whatever it takes to enable the activation of this power pool, so that we can then allow developers, private and both Kenyan and the private sector, to put more money, put more investments in terms of building power plants. And we build not just for ourselves, but also to trade with the region. And of course, I think it was also mentioned a bit on e-mobility. E-mobility is going to be big. Again, this is another import substitution kind of thing. So we reduce the amount of petroleum we're bringing in for our motorbikes and for our cars. It's gradually building up. There are more and more companies that are now developing like electrical motorbikes. Electric cars will also be big in the coming future. So, and the idea is not just mobility. Of course, mobility is the first thing that we look at in terms of removing the amount of petroleum we use, but also in itself, e-mobility would help us do a lot of work in terms of grid stability. We are facing some challenges as regards to the variable renewable energy sources and the availability of a wider and more dispersed kind of battery storage. And you could think of this as parking your electric car in the night and putting it connected onto the grid. This will provide us quite some usefulness in terms of, there are times in the night when the demand is not so high, but things like geothermal plants are still producing. Sometimes you flare, sometimes we flare a resource, which is not the best way to use a resource that we spend millions to get. And the activation of storage, whether it's grid scale or through the e-mobility, through cars, will really be crucial in the future. I think would serve those are the ones I would want to highlight at the moment.
Thanks a lot, George. Those are really interesting ideas, especially on, and I think it's a really practical way of leveraging geothermal, especially for fertilizer and reducing both the fertilizer subsidy that exists, balancing the intra-Africa energy trade, and also reducing the cost of diesel and petroleum products, which at the same time reduces the carbon emissions as well. So thank you for sharing those ideas. I will now almost move to the questions from the audience. But before that, I would like to give all the speakers about 1 or 2 minutes to make any closing statements. So thank you once again for all your thoughts and ideas. And I'll start with Dr. Algola. If you could just share your closing comments on today's discussion and your thoughts, especially maybe on any future policy direction. I think you've shared substantially, but please do share your closing remarks, everyone. Starting with you, Dr. Algola. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I just also want to thank the participants for listening. In closing, I would like to say that geothermal energy is the future of Kenya. And I also want to say that with that knowledge, we need to build a very broad-based capacity in all the various disciplines in order to carry this. And we also need to mobilize enough resources to make sure that it happens, and also start the process of exploiting the low temperature geothermal projects. At the end of it, what we are looking for are the energy services that we get from this process. And we should do this in mind that, bearing in mind that there are also other upcoming energy projects like solar, wind, and also assess the potential of having hybrid systems and the social benefit that this can bring to our communities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Algola. Dr. Omenda, over to you.
Thank you very much. Again, I'll speak in support of geothermal development. Also, whereas George was indicating that we really need to go big, but I'd like to say that we need to go big, but also go small. We really need to promote the small scale mini-grid type of geothermal, because we know there's some resources which are too small to put on the national grid. And yet it is an energy source that can provide cheap electricity. And with that electricity, there can be mineral recovery and many other byproducts, direct use. And that's where the Geothermal Village that Marita mentioned, that we are currently doing a research on Geothermal Village, which is an integrated utilization of geothermal resources, including small power generation and direct applications. and the electricity can be used to pump water for irrigation for the community. So we see geothermal energy providing total solution to a village in quotes. And our projects are number one here in Homa Hills, one is in Rwanda, another one is in Ethiopia, and one in Djibouti. So in the coming years, we hope to see a pilot plant coming up in one or more of these areas where we have a typical geothermal village. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Menda. Professor Marita, over to you.
Thank you, sir. My closing remarks are, again, more focus to be put on developing low geothermal enthalpy regions. And the government should actually take it upon itself. Yes, that's already taken by the creation of GDC. It should regard geothermal development as almost developing an infrastructure activity. Like in building up roads, it doesn't question whether you will have any benefit in the short term, but they look at it as, you know, as a spilling effect in which we develop some infrastructure. In the long run, in other activities can come into play. So my closing remarks will be that government should go down. It has created GDC to generate electricity, or, you know, with a long-term generation of electricity. But also now they could also embark on developing of low enthalpy areas by investing heavily or by giving subsidies. As Clifford said, and there's no private investor who want to put his money into developing low enthalpy areas, but the government can actually assist in these projects. Thank you.
Sure, thank you very much, Professor Marita. Over to you, Mr. Clifford.
Thanks. So I think that, you know, geothermal is the future for Kenya. Geothermal is Kenya's most important and unique resource. And I think that the past efforts to set a very clear policy and investment plan for geothermal have not fully produced the clarity for the sector that it needs. There's still questions as, you know, where's the dividing line of responsibility between KenGen and GDC? What exactly is the GDC business plan, and how can it contribute best to the development of geothermal resources across the spectrum of power generation and low enthalpy community activities, and what exactly is the division of public investment versus you know, leveraging private capital, and what are the business models on which private capital can most efficiently be brought into the system. There's been so much, you know, review and discussion of this, but I feel that still the conclusion isn't really there. The clarity isn't really there. So I hope that we get there in the coming period.
Thank you very much for your insights and comments. Finally, I'll come to George. Perhaps he can provide some clarity in his capacity as chairperson of the two boards of KEPSA as well as ESAC. So over to you, George.
Yeah, thanks, Utsav. Again, I think I come from the electricity side of things, so we really do see an opportunity to seize the opportunity in geothermal in terms of the resource to push what the country can do on the electricity side to even greater levels. You know, the more we can enable our economic development, the more funds we have even to do even other things. And with all due respect, also, I do acknowledge there's a need to develop, of course, the low enthalpy side of geothermal and the more community applications. But I think it would also be a crime for us not to try and push to see what else can be done on the bigger side. Kenya is in such a unique position to kind of take advantage of our resources to do much bigger things in regional level. And I think in the coming years, we will see a lot of effort towards that, even as we do develop these more communal kind of uses of geothermal and other energy sources, because this also then links with your mini grids, with the solar home systems. But even as we do the small, we also have to do the big. So mine again is just to encourage us to really take advantage of what I would say God has blessed us with as a country, and just use it to propel us to the next level in terms of economic development. Thank you, sir.
Perfect. Thank you very much, George. Really appreciate your comments. Some of the key takeaways for me today, really to learn and understand on the geothermal potential, is the fact that the drilling costs are often 70% of the total cost of the project. And that's the risk which through learning, and there is a high success rate that we can kind of de-risk that. If we can manage that component, we can de-risk, we can bring in IPPs. Another takeaway for me was that there's a lot of low enthalpy applications. Also, to empower rural communities, developing those low enthalpy areas in remote communities is really, really important. In terms of new applications, we have the green hydrogen, we have intra-Africa energy trade. And as Dr. Algola also mentioned, there is the potential revenue for carbon credits. And I was just checking the facts as he was speaking. I think KenGen has the capacity to do 1.5 million tons of carbon per year. And it's already sold about 500,000 carbon credits at 119 million shillings as of July 2021 last year. So the potential is almost 3 times of that annually in terms of generating revenue from carbon credits just from the Olkaria. So exploring the potential of carbon credit in geothermal business models, especially for smaller IPPs, would also be really interesting to kind of diversify the revenue source. So we'll move on to the questions. I do thank all the speakers and panelists for joining in again today, and look forward to future conversations where we could operationalize projects and plans so that we achieve the goal of economic empowerment. Thank you very much. The first question, I believe, is, I think, will utilizing the geothermal energy affect seismic and volcanic activities and also climate change? So perhaps, Dr. Amanda, you could answer this. Will geothermal energy affect seismic and volcanic activities?
Exploitation of a geothermal resource may generate low-level earthquake, which you may not feel without an instrument, because as the fluid goes from the reservoir, there's a bit of seismic activity generated, usually very, very weak, you can feel it. In terms of generating volcanism, it cannot. In a way, it might even hinder, because you reduce the energy stored within the subsurface. And therefore, geothermal cannot initiate a volcanic activity. For example, in Menengai, when drilling to 2.5 kilometers, they're able to drill even up to liquid magma, and a volcano never erupted. So geothermal is a clean and easy to utilize a geothermal resource. In terms of seismicity, is very low. But nonetheless, all geothermal projects, there's a demand that seismic network is installed so that this is monitored in real time. So all the projects developed are safe. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There was another question for you, Dr. Amanda, on the fact that there was a red circle on South Sudan in your presentation. So does that mean South Sudan has geothermal potential?
Yes, South Sudan has geothermal potential. We think it could be low to medium temperature resource. We've not been able to access the area though, but if the person who said the question knows how we can get there, then we'd be willing to make arrangements to really visit and see if it can be developed either for electricity or for other uses. Thank you.
Thank you. And this question is open to who can answer it. Does anyone know of companies or institutions doing research and development of geothermal in Malawi? Dr. Marita, maybe.
Marita. But I may mention that there used to be a company that was licensed to explore and develop geothermal resources in Malawi, but it became difficult for them. And therefore, the main active player that I know of is the government, with the geological department currently doing active research on geothermal in the area. But Marita can comment also.
No, I'm not aware, but it's possible to get this information from the International Geothermal Association or the International Energy Association.
Sure, thank you. There's also some questions on geothermal with reference to energy transition, which I believe Dr. Algola has a reference to. I think if you go to our agenda on the Sankalp website, you can find the LinkedIn pages of all of our speakers. So definitely do get in touch again, and we look forward to answering your questions and continuing the conversation on geothermal. I think we are out of time today, but thank you very much everyone for joining in, and look forward to being in touch. Have a nice evening. Bye.
Have a nice
Thank
evening.
you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.